In 1368, a peasant who had once begged for food in the streets stood at the gates of the most powerful city on earth. Behind him, an army of farmers and bandits. In front of him, the palace of the Mongol emperor, the descendant of Genghis Khan himself, the man who had conquered half the world. If the peasant won, the largest land empire in human history would collapse overnight. If he lost, he would be skinned alive before sundown. He took a breath, raised his sword, and gave the order to attack. And from that single moment, the empire that had once swallowed China whole began to vanish from the face of the earth. But to understand how an empire that ruled from Korea to Hungary could be destroyed by a beggar with a sword, we have to go back. Back to a windswept patch of grass in Mongolia, where a boy with no shoes was about to become the most feared man who ever lived. And that boy's name was Temujin. In 1162, Temujin was born in a tent on the freezing steppes of Mongolia. His father was a minor tribal chief, which sounds impressive until you realize that being a tribal chief in Mongolia meant you owned roughly 15 goats and one slightly nicer tent than your neighbors. When Temujin was 9, his father was poisoned by a rival tribe. His mother was kicked out of the clan. He grew up eating roots and mice, watching his siblings starve through the long winters. By the time he was a teenager, he had already killed his own half-brother in a fight over a fish. This was not a man destined to retire peacefully. By the year 1206, this barefoot orphan had united every warring tribe across Mongolia into one terrifying army. The tribal leaders gathered together and gave him a new name, a name that would echo across continents for the next 800 years. Genghis Khan, universal ruler, and he had one tiny ambition. He wanted to conquer everything his horse could ride to, and his horses, as it turned out, could ride very, very far. The world had no idea what was coming. The kingdoms to the south were rich, civilized, and protected by the biggest wall ever built by human hands. They thought they were safe. They were extremely, catastrophically wrong. South of Mongolia sat China, and at this point in history, China was not one country. It was split into 3 separate kingdoms that all hated each other. The biggest and richest was the Jin Dynasty in the north, ruled by a people called the Jurchens. They had gold, silk, gunpowder, paper money, and cities so massive they made European capitals look like muddy villages. They also had the Great Wall, miles of stone and packed earth designed to keep exactly one kind of person out. Nomadic horsemen from the north. People, in other words, exactly like Genghis Khan. The Jin Emperor wasn't worried. He'd been collecting tribute from the Mongols for years. Every so often, a Mongol chief would show up with horses and furs, bow deeply, and hand them over. So when Genghis Khan refused to pay tribute in 1210, the new Jin Emperor laughed. Then he sent a messenger north with a very stern letter. His Majesty demands your tribute immediately. Tell your emperor I spit in his direction. Sir, that's treason. Then tell him I'm coming to spit on him personally. You can't cross the Great Wall. Watch me. In 1211, Genghis Khan led around 90,000 horsemen south. The Jin army had nearly 500,000 soldiers, walled cities, and the most advanced weapons on the planet. On paper, the Mongols should have been wiped out. In reality, they tore through northern China like a thresher through wheat. The Mongols didn't fight like anyone else. They didn't march, they galloped. They could ride for 3 days without sleeping, shoot arrows backwards at full speed, and live for weeks on horse blood and dried milk. When they reached a walled city, they did something that made the Chinese general's blood run cold. They didn't attack the city. They surrounded it, cut off the food, and waited. And when the city finally surrendered, Genghis Khan offered the residents a choice. Open the gates and become Mongol subjects, or refuse and have every single person inside, every man, woman, child, dog, and chicken slaughtered in the streets. Word spread fast. By 1215, the Jin capital of Zhongdu, where modern Beijing stands today, fell to the Mongols. The streets were piled so high with bodies that travelers said the ground was greasy with human fat for months afterward. This was just the beginning. Genghis Khan kept conquering for the next 16 years. He smashed through Persia, leveled cities in Afghanistan, and sent armies riding into Russia. By the time he died in 1227, his empire stretched from the Pacific Ocean to the Caspian Sea. Nobody knows exactly how he died. Some say he fell off his horse. Some say he was killed by a captured princess. What we do know is that he was buried in a secret grave somewhere in Mongolia. His soldiers killed every single person who saw the funeral procession, then killed the soldiers who killed those people, and then trampled the grave with thousands of horses until nobody could ever find it. To this day, nobody has. But here's the thing. Genghis Khan never actually finished conquering China. The Jin dynasty in the north was wrecked, sure, but the south of China was ruled by a completely different kingdom called the Song dynasty. And the Song were rich. Insanely rich. They had the biggest economy on the planet, the world's first paper money, gunpowder weapons, and warships the size of small islands. Genghis's sons and grandsons kept the war going for decades. They finally crushed what was left of the Jin in 1234. But every time they pushed into Song territory, they hit a wall. Literally. The south of China was full of rivers, rice paddies, jungles, and mountains. Terrible terrain for cavalry. The Mongols were the greatest horsemen in history, and suddenly their horses were knee-deep in mud, sinking into swamps, and being shot at from walled cities they couldn't surround. For almost 40 years, the Mongols couldn't crack the south. Then in 1260, a new Khan took the throne, and this guy was different. This guy had a plan. His name was Kublai Khan, and he was Genghis's grandson. But he hadn't grown up in a tent on the steppes eating mice. He'd been raised around Chinese scholars, Buddhist monks, and Persian merchants. He spoke multiple languages. He wore silk robes. He liked Chinese food, Chinese art, and Chinese philosophy. The other Mongol princes thought he was soft. He drinks tea instead of fermented mare's milk. He reads books, with words in them. This is what our grandfather conquered the world for. They had no idea what Kublai was about to do. Kublai Khan looked at the map and realized something his cousins hadn't. You couldn't conquer China by riding a horse at it. China was too big, too wet, and too clever for that. If you wanted to rule China, you had to become Chinese, at least a little bit. So Kublai did something no Mongol ruler had ever done. He moved his capital. He picked up the entire imperial court and dragged it from the freezing grasslands of Mongolia down to a brand new city he was building on the ruins of old Zhongdu. He called it Dadu, the great capital. Today we call it Beijing. He hired Chinese architects, Persian engineers, and Tibetan monks. He built palaces with curved roofs, gardens with artificial lakes, and roads wide enough for 10 horses to ride side by side. Marco Polo would visit this city a few decades later and write that it was so magnificent, nobody back home in Europe would believe it existed. Then in 1271, Kublai did something even more shocking. He declared himself the founder of a brand new Chinese dynasty. He gave it a Chinese name, the Yuan, which means the beginning. He started wearing imperial yellow robes. He performed ancient Chinese ceremonies at the altar of heaven. He told the Chinese people, "I am not a foreign invader. I am your new emperor. The mandate of heaven has passed to me." A lot of his Mongol relatives were horrified. "Cousin, what are you wearing? It's an imperial robe. You look like a Chinese bureaucrat." "I am a Chinese bureaucrat now. Grandfather conquered them so we could rule them, not become them. And how exactly has that been working out for the last 40 years? While the Mongol princes argued, Kublai got to work on his real problem, the Song dynasty in the south. He couldn't beat them on land, so he did something no Mongol had ever attempted. He built a navy from scratch. He hired Korean shipbuilders, Chinese sailors, and Arab navigators. Within a few years, the man whose ancestors had never seen the ocean commanded one of the largest fleets on Earth. In 1279, that fleet sailed south and caught the last Song emperor and his court at a place called Yemen. What happened next would be remembered as one of the most heartbreaking scenes in Chinese history. The Song fleet was trapped against the rocky coast of southern China. Around 1,000 warships, the last hope of a 300-year-old dynasty surrounded by Kublai's navy. On the flagship sat the Song emperor. He was 8 years old. His name was Zhao Bing, and he was holding the hand of his chief minister, a man named Lu Zufu. For days, the two fleets traded fire. Mongol arrows rained onto Song decks. Song catapults hurled stones at Mongol ships. Then on March 19, 1279, the Song lines finally broke. Mongol vessels poured through the gap. Lu Zufu looked down at the little boy emperor, and he understood. There was no escape. There was no future. There was no Song dynasty anymore. He picked up the child, tied him to his back with sashes of silk, and walked calmly to the edge of the ship. Then he stepped off into the sea. Witnesses said that when news spread through the rest of the fleet, hundreds of Song officials and soldiers jumped overboard after them. Bodies floated on the water for miles. After 300 years, the Song dynasty was gone. And for the first time in history, all of China, every river, every rice paddy, every walled city, every silk farm belonged to a Mongol emperor. Kublai Khan had done what his grandfather couldn't. He had finished the conquest. The Yuan dynasty was now the most powerful empire on earth. It ruled over 80 million people. It controlled the Silk Road from end to end. Caravans of merchants, missionaries, and adventurers from as far away as Italy could travel safely across an entire continent for the first time in human history. This was the period historians call the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace. But Kublai wasn't satisfied. He wanted more. He sent armies into Vietnam. They got hammered by jungle warfare and disease and slunk back home with nothing. He sent armies into Burma. Same story. Then he made the worst decision of his entire reign. He decided to invade Japan. He built the biggest invasion fleet the world had ever seen, around 4,400 ships and 140,000 men. He sailed them across the sea toward the Japanese coast, and then a typhoon showed up. The Japanese called the storm Kamikaze, the divine wind, and it destroyed almost everything. Tens of thousands of Mongol soldiers drowned. Ships were smashed into splinters against the rocks. The samurai of Japan walked out onto the beaches the next morning and killed every survivor they could find. Kublai tried again 7 years later. He built an even bigger fleet, and almost unbelievably, another typhoon hit at almost the exact same time of year. The Japanese were now convinced that the gods themselves were protecting their islands. They might have had a point. Kublai was furious. He wanted to try a third invasion. His advisors quietly begged him to stop. The empire was running out of money. The conquered Chinese were taxed to the breaking point. Rice paddies were being abandoned. Floods on the Yellow River were going unrepaired because the treasury was empty. And Kublai, the man who had once dressed in elegant silk robes and discussed philosophy with Tibetan monks, was falling apart. His favorite wife died. Then his chosen heir died. He started drinking constantly. He ate so much that doctors couldn't even weigh him anymore. He developed gout so badly he couldn't walk. He sat in his palace, bloated and grieving, ordering wars he couldn't win. In 1294, Kublai Khan died at the age of 78. He was buried in secret beside his grandfather in Mongolia. Nobody knows where. And the moment he was gone, the cracks in the Yuan dynasty started spreading. Here's the problem nobody had really solved. The Mongols ruled China, but they were vastly outnumbered. There were maybe 1.5 million Mongols sitting on top of around 80 million Chinese. So to keep control, the Yuan emperors had set up a caste system. At the top sat the Mongols. Just below them were foreigners. Persians, Arabs, Central Asians, even a few Europeans like Marco Polo. They got the cushy government jobs. Below them sat the northern Chinese. And at the very bottom, treated like second-class citizens in their own country, sat the southern Chinese. The same people whose grandparents had thrown themselves off ships rather than submit to Mongol rule. If this sounds familiar, it should. It was almost exactly the same trick Spain would later pull in the Americas, ranking people by where they were born, handing the top jobs to the conquerors. And it created the same boiling rage just under the surface. That rage was about to find a leader. After Kublai died, the Yuan dynasty went through emperors the way other dynasties went through dinner. In just 40 years, 9 different men sat on the throne. Some were murdered, some were poisoned, some were teenagers who barely knew where the palace bathroom was. The Mongol nobles fought each other constantly over who got to be the next puppet. Meanwhile, the actual government, the people running the country, just kind of gave up. Roads stopped being repaired. Bandits took over the highways. The paper money Kublai had been so proud of became worthless because the treasury kept printing more to pay for wars and palaces. Then in 1344, the Yellow River decided it had seen enough. The Yellow River is the second longest river in China, and for thousands of years it had been called the River of Sorrow because every few generations it would jump its banks and drown entire provinces. The Yuan had let the dikes fall apart. So when the river flooded in 1344, it didn't just flood, it changed course. It rerouted itself across hundreds of miles of farmland, wiped out cities, and killed possibly millions of people. In a tiny village in central China, a 16-year-old boy named Zhu Yuanzhang watched his entire family die. First the floods came, then the famine came, then the plague came. In the space of a few weeks, his father starved to death, his mother starved to death. His older brother starved to death. His brother's wife and baby starved to death. Zhu was left alone with no money, no food, and no way to even bury his parents. A neighbor finally gave him a patch of dirt to dig grave in. The boy buried his family with his bare hands. Then he wandered off into the countryside to find work. Nobody hired him. He ended up at a Buddhist monastery, where the monks let him sweep floors in exchange for thin rice porridge. When the monastery itself ran out of food, the abbot kicked him out with a wooden bowl and told him to beg his way through the world. For 3 years, the future emperor of China walked from village to village, holding out his bowl, sleeping in barns, dodging soldiers. He saw everything. He saw what the Mongols had done to his country, and he was building a list. When Zhu Yuanzhang was 24, he heard about a rebellion. Across China, peasants had started tying red cloths around their heads and rising up against the Mongols. They called themselves the Red Turbans, and they believed that a Buddha of light was coming to drive out the demons and restore China to the Chinese. The Yuan army was crushing them in some places and losing badly in others. Zhu thought about it for exactly one night. Then he picked up his begging bowl, walked out of the monastery, and joined the nearest Red Turban camp. He turned out to be terrifyingly good at war. He couldn't read or write. He had no military training. He had spent his entire life either farming or starving. But he had something most generals didn't have. He understood peasants. He knew what they were afraid of, what they wanted, what they would die for. He led raids from the front. He shared his food with his soldiers. He refused to loot villages, which made him almost unique among rebel commanders. Within a few years, men were deserting other Red Turban armies just to fight under him. By 1356, Zhu's army captured the city of Nanjing on the Yangtze River. This was a big deal. Nanjing was one of the richest cities in southern China, and the Yangtze was the perfect natural defense. Zhu set up his headquarters there and started doing something none of the other rebel leaders bothered with. He set up a government. He appointed officials. He repaired roads. He reopened schools. He started collecting taxes in an organized way instead of just stealing from peasants. Sir, the other rebel leaders are just raiding villages for supplies. And how is that working out for them? They have more food in the short term. And what about next year? They'll have to find new villages to raid. And the year after that, they'll run out of villages. Exactly. While they're feeding their armies for today, I'm building a country for tomorrow. The Yuan, caught in Beijing, was too busy fighting itself to notice that a former beggar was quietly assembling a state in the south. By 1363, Zhu had crushed his biggest rival, a fellow rebel named Chen Yuliang, in a massive naval battle on Lake Poyang. Hundreds of warships burned. The lake turned red. And southern China, the same land that had been Song territory 80 years earlier, was now Zhu's. In 1367, Zhu Yuanzhang looked north and decided it was time. He had southern China. He had an army of 250,000 soldiers, hardened by 20 years of fighting. He had warships, cannons, and gunpowder weapons that the Mongols themselves had introduced to China, but had since forgotten how to use properly. He drafted a public declaration, the kind of document emperors usually write. Except he wasn't an emperor yet. He was still technically a peasant rebel with a bowl in his luggage. The declaration was simple: drive out the barbarians. Restore China to the Chinese. Every Mongol who surrenders peacefully will be spared. Every Mongol who resists will be erased. His armies marched north in the spring of 1368. They moved fast. Province after province fell without serious resistance, partly because the Chinese peasants in those areas opened their gates the moment Zhu's banners appeared. By summer, his generals were closing in on Beijing itself, the city Kublai Khan had built 100 years earlier as the showpiece of Mongol power in China. Inside the imperial palace, the last Yuan emperor was a man named Toghon Temur. He was 48 years old, descended directly from Genghis Khan, and frankly, he was tired. He had spent his entire reign watching the empire crumble around him. Ministers schemed, generals defected, rebels burned cities he had been told would never fall. When word arrived that Zhu's army was 3 days from the gates, Toghon Temür didn't even try to fight. "Pack the imperial treasures. All of them, your majesty. Whatever you can carry, we leave tonight." "Where are we going?" "Home, we're going home." "This is home, your majesty." No, this was 100 years of pretending. Saddle the horses. On the night of September 10th, 1368, Toghon Temür slipped out of Beijing with his family and what was left of his court. They rode north through the same passes their ancestors had ridden south through generations earlier. They didn't stop until they were back on the grasslands of Mongolia. A few days later, Zhu Yuanzhang's army walked into Beijing without firing a single arrow. The capital of Kublai Khan, the city that had dazzled Marco Polo, the heart of the largest empire in human history, fell to a former beggar in absolute silence. The Yuan Dynasty was over. But the story of what came next is even stranger. Earlier that same year, before he even took Beijing, Zhu Yuanzhang had already made it official. On January 23rd, 1368, the beggar who had buried his family with his bare hands climbed a ceremonial altar in Nanjing, put on imperial robes for the first time in his life, and declared himself the founder of a brand new Chinese dynasty. He called it the Ming, meaning brilliant. He took the reign name Hongwu, meaning vastly martial. A man who had once stolen scraps from temple kitchens was now the son of heaven. He would rule China for the next 30 years, and he would rule it with a level of paranoia that makes most dictators look chill. He executed tens of thousands of officials, including most of the generals who had helped him win his throne. He trusted nobody. He had reason not to. Up in Mongolia, the surviving Yuan court refused to admit they had lost. They called themselves the Northern Yuan and kept claiming to be the rightful emperors of China for another 200 years. The Ming kept sending armies north to crush them. Sometimes the Mongols won. Mostly they didn't. They never came close to retaking China. The horsemen who had once shaken the world were now divided into squabbling tribes again, fighting over goats and pastureland, just like in the days before Genghis Khan was born. The wheel had turned all the way around. Today, when you walk through Beijing, you're walking through Kublai Khan's blueprint. The grid of streets, the placement of the Forbidden City, the wide ceremonial roads. All of it sits on Mongol foundations. The paper money you use anywhere on Earth descended from the Yuan experiment. The Silk Road trade that brought spaghetti to Italy, gunpowder to Europe, and the Black Death to half the world, all of it flowed through Mongol territory during their century of dominance. They lost the empire, but they reshaped the planet on their way down. And it all started with a barefoot orphan on the Mongolian steppes who decided 15 goats wasn't enough. And it ended with another barefoot orphan in a flooded Chinese village, deciding that one bowl of rice wasn't either. If you made it this far, you probably love history as much as we do. So hit like, hit subscribe for more deep dives like this, and check out the next video on your screen right now. I'll catch you next time.